Welcome to the second in a series of 3 Burton and Inglis lectures, which Michael Feuer has happily agreed to deliver. Michael, as many of you know who know him, is the executive director of DBAS, the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education, in the National Research Council of the National Academies, where he was formerly the director of the Center for Education and the founding director of the Board on Testing and Assessment. Before joining the NRC in 1993, Michael served as a senior analyst and study director at the Office of Technology Assessment. He holds a PhD in public policy from the University of Pennsylvania, where his research focused on mathematical modeling and human resource planning in hierarchical organizations. He also has an MA from the Wharton School and has studied at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Sorbonne. And I could go on. In fact, I have 2 more pages of stuff about him, but I think rather than go on about where you went to elementary school, I think I will simply let you take the microphone. Michael.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and I'm so glad we didn't get to those 2 extra pages. Well, it's great to be back. I want to say again thanks to all of you, a special thanks to Ellen and to the folks here at the Ed School. Sean, in particular, has been a great logistician, pampering me with all of my anxiety-ridden questions about whether or not to take the plane, the train, or the bus. Anyway, thank you very much for all of your help. I am happy to report that I don't have PowerPoint slides tonight. I was told recently that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'm going to avoid those things for a while. And actually, I'm interested in having a conversation, so I want to try to keep things moving and keep it short. I have to tell you that I recently gave a talk, and midway through, someone walked out. And then, sort of toward the end, by the time I was just about wrapping up, he walked back in. And so I said to him afterwards, so why did you walk out in the middle like that? And he said, well, he needed a haircut. So I said, well, why didn't you get your haircut before I started talking? He said, because then I didn't think I needed one. Anyway, so I do want to try to be to the point here. And without PowerPoint, I have to use another device so that I don't wander too much. And the device will be to tell you now what the 3 or 4 main points are. And then if you see me start to wander too much, you can sort of drag me back. The first thing I want to do is give you a quick reminder of the story I'm telling in these 3 papers and where we left off last time. Then I'm going to offer a brief digression with a few comparative comments about the U.S. and France, of all things, mainly to motivate the main theme for tonight, which is about the complexity of American schooling. And then I want to get into 3 examples, 3 cases, 3 issues in American education policy that work for me, at least, in telling this story. Now, I've chosen those 3 examples as a good scientist would, because they work and because I know a little something about them. So we'll see how we do. And I think I have about 45 minutes to do this in, so we'll get right to it. Here's the basic storyline, which is what I left you with last time. Cognitive psychology, cognitive science, is a branch of the social sciences where theories of human rationality, the ideas about rational decision-making and information processing reside primarily, and in fact where they were, I think, born. As cognitive psychology began to mature, it found application in at least 2 very important areas. One being learning theory, about which you can read tons of literature by now, very nicely summarized, I should say, by an NRC report called How People Learn and some of its sequelae. And also about how people teach, that is, how people should teach, and what people need to learn in order to be able to teach, and even how this applies to the development of the measurement of learning that, in a way, captures more accurately the cognitive processes that go on in teaching and learning. So that's one area in which cognitive psychology has made a very, very dramatic, I think, impact. The second area is in organization theory more generally, and even in public policy in certain areas. And here the idea is that the ways in which human beings organize complex transactions and either write or implicitly enter into contracts that govern those arrangements can be modeled and can be explained through lessons from cognitive psychology, and in particular, and you'll hear a lot about this tonight, the work of people like Herbert Simon, whose ideas about cognitive psychology and the workings of the human mind have had a very significant influence on the way we think about organizations, and to some extent, some influence about the way we think about at least some areas of public policy. And now I get to the big ironic twist in these lectures, and that's what I'm trying to deal with. And that is that though cognitive psychology has had this important effect on teaching and learning and some effect on organization theory, it has had almost no effect on the way we think about the organization of schooling and public policy about education, with a few exceptions, which I never miss an opportunity to plug my good friend Dick Murnane's 1984 paper, which is one of the few examples of an attempt to actually bring to bear some of these notions to a theory of education. But it's been scant other than that. So that's the basic storyline in these papers. And I left off last time with the promise that in this lecture tonight I would try to begin the argument, to build the argument about why this idea of a science of rationality might actually shed some light on schools and schooling policy. And in order to illustrate, and so the purpose tonight really is to try to begin building this argument and to make the point that what I refer to here as procedural rationality, which is a phrase coined by Herbert Simon, which has to do with decisions that are intendedly rational but only limited in their capacity to be rational. That is, because human beings suffer from bounded rationality, that is, limits to their cognitive capacity, attempts to be rational for problems of anything other than quite trivial dimensions require something other than what might be viewed as a purely rational approach. And the metaphor that I used last time, and it's popular in this business, is the traveling salesman story. I'm not going to tell you that story again. I will tell you, however, that my friend Bob Hauser, who is a very distinguished sociologist, just told me last night, actually, that this whole line of reasoning and my obsession or my preoccupation with the limits to human rationality remind him a little bit of the book that the Pope has just published, in which apparently he dismisses the Enlightenment and its attempts to seek human perfectibility. And so I had two words for Bob Hauser, oy vey, essentially. So I thought I was having enough trouble here meeting the standard of Lawrence Kremen, and now I've got to deal with the Pope. But that aside, it's actually much more complicated than whether I believe in human perfectibility or not, and maybe we'll have time to get there. That's the storyline, and I don't want to repeat the last lecture because I won't be invited back for the third one if I try to do that. So let me push ahead with a brief digression, true story. This was a meeting in Washington hosted by the president of the National Academy of Sciences, with Claude Allegra, who at the time was the Minister of Education in France. Himself a distinguished scientist, he happens to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And he was here with an entourage and talking to us about school reform in France, and here's what he said, more or less. In the spring, I decided to adopt the hands-on method for science education. By the beginning of the new school year, all French students were learning from the new curriculum. As you might imagine, the minister's awestruck audience, essentially a small group of American education policy wonks like myself, and some scientists, friends of Bruce Albert's, who are chronically frustrated with the appearance of an American school system that always seems to be inferior and in decline, could hardly contain their envy. One of them said something to the effect, oh, if we only had that kind of central authority. If only we had that kind of central control. And this was 1999, so people were still thinking about standards-based reform, and this was the zeitgeist, so the idea of this kind of central authority was sort of on people's minds. Allegra was a consummate diplomat, understood what was going on, and sympathized with us, and then offered this wise caution. He said, yes, it's true, you know, we do have substantial power vested in the central government, and that allows us to change teaching quite rapidly. But don't forget, when the government has that kind of concentrated power, so does the opposition. And sure enough, he knew what he was talking about, because 6 months later, he was out, essentially removed from office under pressure from the very powerful, centrally organized teachers' union in France. The actual fight was less about hands-on science teaching and more about whether teachers were going to be required to participate in any kind of training during their summer break. We don't have time for a complete digression into a comparison between the US and France, and besides, we have enough problems with our European allies right now without me further complicating things. So I do want to say that that incident with Minister Allegra stuck with me, and it helps me think about the very special nature of the American system, if that's the right word, of schooling on a number of dimensions. And in fact, this anecdote about Claude Allegra, and you know, I saw some smiles around when I mentioned what he said about how we wanted something on Thursday and next week everybody was reading. There is this myth about, you know, French schooling, that on any given day all kids are reading out of the same page of the textbook. People who actually know more about it, like Dan Resnick and to some extent Lauren Resnick, have cautioned me that there's a little bit more mythology there than truth, and that in fact things are not quite as rigidly centralized. Nonetheless, I think there are some important lessons that one can take from this kind of comparison. And if you think about it, the comparison really needs to be unfolded on a number of dimensions. First is the business of public versus private provision of education. For me, the surprise is not that France has a publicly and centrally controlled education system. The surprise is that the U.S., which prides itself and is somewhat obsessed with the virtues of free enterprise, has nonetheless maintained a system of public schooling for now 150 plus years, in spite of all these pressures, to try something more privately managed. My candidate for the runner-up in in the contest for the longest running public entity in the U.S. might be Social Security, and that's, of course, coming in for a little bit of a drubbing now intellectually, if not actuarially. But if you think about it, public schooling in the U.S. has actually survived for a long time in spite of the fact that it is otherwise in a rather, under vast pressure in a society that believes in free enterprise. So on the public versus private thing, actually the comparison with France or with other systems starts to suggest some similarities as much as differences. On the matter of whether it's, whether France is more or less centralized or whether we are more or less decentralized, well, aside from those of us who still yearn for something like national standards, I think maybe the comparison here isn't using the right frame to begin with. We ought to perhaps be thinking about comparing France to some of the larger American states, where in fact, if you did it that way, you'd end up thinking about places, jurisdictions, where there's a great bit of cultural, historical, and political identity, and certainly with respect to population size and with respect to other factors. And then if you did that, you'd realize that, in fact, our state departments of education have a lot of the same control and a lot of the same capacity as the central ministry in France. So even there are some things that are similar. My point here, again, is that we seem in the U.S. to have opted for an interesting hybrid model of trying for a decentralized system draped in a flag that says something like e pluribus unum. And that's very special about the U.S. system. That is, I think, different from most others. We'll say more about the attempt to bridge these ideals later on. And then finally, there's the question of actually how do we govern a system like this, and whether we use principles of markets or principles of bureaucracy in order to manage our education system and in order to hold it accountable in some way. Here again, I think in thinking about the comparison, can't help noticing that although there has been a little bit of an uptick in support for the out-and-out voucher concept in the U.S., notwithstanding now something like 50 years of libertarians salivating at Milton Friedman's original article on this topic, there isn't really much going on. Now, the hybrid, of course, is that we have made some very interesting moves in the direction of charter schools and so-called public choice models. And if you think about that, that's again, I think, an example of the American spirit of trying to get the best of both worlds. Some of the ideals of competition, but still controlled or at least held accountable through principles of bureaucratic management. All of this puts together, for me, it works very nicely with what the once president of Harvard, James Conant, said. When one tells a foreign visitor that we have tens of thousands of local school boards with vast powers over the elementary schools and the high schools, he is apt to say, this is not a system but a chaos. To which I always reply, yes, but it works. Most of us like it, and it appears to be as permanent a feature of our society as most of our political institutions. That's the end of my digression into comparative education politics, the whole point of which was simply to say there are very special features of the way the U.S. has decided or fallen into its system of governing education that rule out, at least for me, the possibility of anything like an optimal solution to this very complex configuration of issues and goals and needs of our system. So now I'm up to trying out some of these more specific examples. The first one is about test-based accountability. I don't think I need to remind this audience that the use of standardized tests to hold schools and teachers accountable is the linchpin of our current education policy, our current, at least at the federal level, our current education reform movement. And by the way, if you don't believe me, you can ask some of your colleagues here, and Dan has fortunately done so much work on this that makes it very easy for us to sort of summarize. The other centerpiece in the current policy story is scientifically based research. And there's lots of very interesting ironies here. And I'll get back to the business about scientifically based research a little bit later, but let me begin then with the test-based accountability story. And here again, it's some data. Every so often, when I'm really forced to, I use some data. Quote, "The results of a test administered to thousands of American students were dismaying. Out of 57,873 possible answers, students answered only 17,216 correctly and accumulated 35,947 errors in punctuation in the process. One child said that rivers in North Carolina and Tennessee run in opposite directions because of the will of God." So you're probably worried that I'm going to now tell you more about the latest TIMSS results. In fact, this is not from the latest round of national assessment or international testing. This is a story that actually comes from one of the very first times that we administered uniform examinations, written examinations in the U.S., and it was about in the roughly 1845. So what that tells me is that our romance with testing in the United States is by no means a one-night stand. And for a system accused of faddishness, there seems to be something about tests and using tests in these ways that displays a remarkable resilience. And it's all the more interesting because of the complex surround in which test-based accountability thrives or survives. Let me summarize. I'm going to skip the short summary and go to a slightly longer one. Popular writing on the history of testing in the U.S. tends to demonize the supply side and blame the testing industry as if they alone are or could be responsible for all of the allegedly overzealous reliance on test scores that we all experience. Not to mention that this testing industry is also frequently blamed for the persistent gaps in achievement, for the persistent inequality in our schools and schooling. And in fact, people like to blame more on the tests, that blame these things more on the tests than on the system that has actually produced that which the tests are giving an indication of. That's what you get a lot of in the popular literature about testing, and the story is much, much more complicated. I sure don't want to spend the evening trying to defend the test publishers as angels of corporate America. But on the other hand, I do think it pays to recall, first of all, that I spent some time studying economics, and I can't do an attack on the supply side without at least considering the possibility that there was some demand for all of this testing. So it pays to keep that in mind. And second, that in fact this fetish we have for testing has very humble and in some ways very laudatory origins. It was, after all, the common school reformers. It was Horace Mann and his pals in pursuit of a school system that could enfranchise the masses and actually bring in to the virtues of ongoing liberal education thousands and thousands of kids who otherwise would have been excluded, and to provide a mechanism that would somehow reassure parents and taxpayers that whatever was being done on behalf of this hugely burgeoning system was doing so, was not doing so, was treating kids, essentially on both sides of the track, as equitably as possible. And so they were the ones who invented essentially standardized testing, although of course they didn't know from multiple choice at the time, but they favored written over oral tests largely on grounds of fairness. And they reached that position long before the invention of reliability statistics. They discovered also along the way the very potent force of test results in exposing the incompetences of teachers and headmasters. And this is long before test-based accountability, quote unquote, became fashionable. And they celebrated the efficiency of written tests over oral examinations as a way to guide student classification and manage these growing school populations, as I said, long before the invention of multiple choice and scorable items. Unfortunately, they were also perhaps the first to miscalculate the unintended effects of reliance on test scores as tools of reform. And in that sense, they were the progenitors of a trend in the misuse of tests that many would argue has always been a stain on the development of what is otherwise a very interesting and sound scientific methodology about human performance and potential. So the tensions involving test use in the U.S. are one way to, for me at least, to get into this business of how complex is this system, and is it rational to think of some kind of optimal solution to this whole problem of what to do about testing. A few examples of the tensions. The economics of large-scale machine scorable tests, which actually makes a big difference if you are trying to enfranchise a huge population of test takers, of students, doesn't work, yet at least, with tests that provide a much more subtle, nuanced, and in-depth analysis of what goes on in teachers' and students' minds as they are performing cognitive functions. Attention. A second one is that we all know that tests create incentives for changed behavior. And in fact, I think that's something that so many people in America have gone to school that they're now all experts on testing. But certainly the one bit of expertise that we all have is that when there's a test that has consequences associated with it, it does tend to change behavior. And the ideal would be that it changes behavior in the direction of more teaching, better teaching, more learning, and more care taken to the subject matter. Unfortunately, however, raising the stakes on test results, as Dan and others have demonstrated now with a huge corpus of empirical evidence, has the, I think, unintended effect of either inflating the scores or narrowing the curriculum and in many fundamental ways distorting the educational process, which tests in their more pristine condition were originally intended to give us an estimate of, an appreciation of. We don't have the thermostat. I'm borrowing here from Tom Schelling's wonderful metaphor. We don't have the thermostat to raise the heat on student and teacher behavior just enough to get the performance that we're looking for without so distorting the system and so distorting the results that we are no longer able to even be confident in that which we are measuring. So if anybody here can invent that thermostat, I work for a scientific organization and I have connections with the National Academy of Engineering, and I assure you, you could get a big prize. By the way, on this business of tests as incentive mechanisms, I've been worrying about this for a long time, and the Board on Testing and Assessment at the Academy has recently really begun to take this on with gusto, and I would refer you with great enthusiasm to the work that Dan's been doing on this, and Eddie Lazier, who is an economist at the Stanford Business School, who has some very interesting ideas about what happens when you raise the stakes. There's other people working on this too, and but I think the time is ripe to actually be thinking about this. Third bit of tension is that when you use tests for accountability, that is to actually give some kind of a report about how well teachers are doing, let's say, and you don't control for what we economists would refer to as exogenous forces that actually, I was going to say cause, but are actually correlated with achievement. You're doing something obviously that's scientifically quite questionable. On the other hand, when you use tests for accountability and you integrate those kinds of controls, it is interpreted by some as an apology or as an excuse for the bad performance that is demonstrated. And this, I mean, some people in this room have been in meetings and in fights over exactly this issue, where the fairness associated with an accountability system is pitted against the perhaps unintended message that, oh, well, if we're talking about poor kids or children of minorities, minority kids, well, now we can sort of wave our hands at the fact that their achievement is that much lower. And when you have a system that is sort of driving towards some kind of a standards-based orientation, this conflict is profound. And there is clearly no thermostat for that, and there is no optimal, to my knowledge, no optimal configuration that can actually solve that problem. Let me skip to the final one, and that is, and there's a few others that I mentioned in the paper, but here's another interesting tension. Largely because of this concern in American society with fairness and with the fair uses of these kinds of measures, the science of testing, psychometrics, has become a very sophisticated science. I got out of econometrics because there were too many. Then I looked in the psychometric, and I left econometrica, and I moved over to psychometrica, and it had gotten even worse. And that's all for the good. I mean, and in fact, psychometrics is one of the examples in education research that really should stand out as a great achievement from the standpoint of science. The unintended effect, however, is that this inflames the perception that the public has about the precision of test scores. After all, it's all very scientific stuff. And anybody who dares to open the appendix, even of one of the NAEP reports, is confronted with a very daunting cognitive task, and can't help but think, boy, this is serious science. These guys must know. And if they're saying that schools in New York are worse than schools in Florida, or vice versa, or whatever they're saying, or these teachers aren't doing as well, this is based on empirical fact. And the irony is that the best psychometricians, at least in the U.S., are the ones who are the most anxious about that overinterpretation of their craft. And yet we haven't figured out a way to really put a thermostat on that either. Where does this lead me? I think you can see that it leads me to what I hope will be in the third paper, an attempt to try to do some bridge building here and to create some basis for, a compromise may not be the right word, but for some procedurally rational way to understand these very complicated tensions. Second example is a sort of offshoot of this test-based accountability thing, but it's got a special twist to it, so I want to tell you the story real quickly. 1997, January of 1997, President Clinton gave a wonderful State of the Union speech. It was longer than my talk tonight, by the way, so you just be grateful that he's not here. But one of the things he did in that speech was announce the plans for what was then known as the voluntary national test. Now, the politics and the history and the story of the voluntary national test, I assure you, is worthy of its own 3 lectures, at least. But just think for a moment about, again, from the standpoint of this persistent historical attempt to get the best of both worlds. Here there was actually the best of all 3 worlds we were trying for. National, testing, and voluntary. Now, there's no other country in the world that would go through this sort of aggravation. But here we were doing this. And actually, I don't quote Checker-Finn more than I have to, but I think on this one he actually got it right. And he said there's only 2 things wrong with the national test. Half the country hates the word national, the other half hates the word test. It was truly a wonderful insight, and I just encourage you to, if you have the time, to go back and read some of what's already been written about that whole episode. But one of the most interesting features here, so you have this business of half the country doesn't like national. This actually became manifest in congressional action and in congressional debates. You had a very mild-mannered congressman, usually mild-mannered congressman from Pennsylvania named Bill Goodling. At that time we had moderate Republicans. He was one of them. And had spent his career really in pursuit of helping American education. And he did this with all of his heart. And he just could not abide the notion of a test being developed by the federal government, because he thought that would be the beginning of a national curriculum, God forbid, managed by the bureaucrats in Washington. So you can see sort of the Republican rhetoric seeping in here, but that's essentially what this fight became about. So Goodling, who was more anxious actually about the national part than about the testing part, said, look, I can't stand the idea of the feds devising a national test and then having that become the basis for a national curriculum. How's this for an idea? All the states are doing testing, more or less, and they either develop their own, they write their own tests, or they use commercially available tests. It's our friends in the testing industry, again, it's a big industry. There's millions of test items being written every day. So why can't we take the results of all these things that are going on at the state level? That's the decentralization ethos in American history right there. Let the states continue to do this, but let's put it all on the same, let's put the results all on the same scale. So we could have, from the pluribus, we could have our unum. Now, just from the standpoint of politics and culture and American history, I have to say that that's just a stunning example. It's also stunning because somehow I think he and some of his staff actually believed so much in psychometrics that it could even accomplish that magic. So you have also the faith in science and technology here, which is all over American education history, all over American history, period. Through the magic of psychometrics, the myriad configurations of content as they are reflected in the curricula of 50 states, and God knows how many school districts, I think we have 18,000 now, summarized in items on almost as many tests, but not quite that many, but still a large number of tests. All of that would be distilled into a reporting system that could essentially give Americans, wherever they lived, an answer to the question of how their kids are doing, and would allow policymakers to make valid comparative judgments about schools here and there. Think again back to what Horace Mann was trying to do with his written exams. It was comparing schools here and there. So here we were again trying it in 1998 and 1999. It was psychometrics to the rescue. Except it wasn't so fast because there was a big dust-up, as you might imagine. And so Congress actually asked the Academy of Sciences to weigh in on this business of whether it was feasible to take all the results of these disparate tests and put them on the same scale. I won't belabor it too much. I encourage you, if you're interested in this, there are two reports we did, one called Uncommon Measures, and the sequel called Embedding Questions. These are really two reports with great titles. The first one, I mean, here's the way the committee saw its charge. Viewed through the lens of our unique experiment in pluralism and federalism, the question motivating this study is both predictable and sensible. Given the rich and increasingly diverse array of tests used by states and districts in pursuit of improved educational performance, can information be provided on a common scale? 5. Can scores on one test be made interpretable in terms of scores on other tests? Can we have more uniform data about student performance from our healthy hodgepodge of state and local programs, et cetera, et cetera? You won't be surprised to hear that the answer from the National Research Council was no. The subtext of which was, stop asking these dumb questions. However, we didn't say that. As a matter of fact, it turned out toward the end of that process, we were very lucky in some ways. Fred Mosteller, who is perhaps the preeminent social statistician of his generation, caused a bit of a stir, something of an earthquake really, in the committee, when at one of the last meetings he said, look, you know, I believe about, you know, all that you've demonstrated here about the flaws and the potential effects on validity and reliability of doing these kinds of linkages, what they call linkage in the testing biz. But for me, the problem is not that there are going to be degradations to the validity and reliability of the test. The question is, how much? How bad are those consequences going to be? By how much will the inferences that are drawn from this testing program be distorted? I can tell you that the committee wished that we had another year and enough money to actually get into that kind of sensitivity analysis. Instead, what happened was we said essentially, no, you can't do this. So they came back and asked the question a different way. Dan was the chair of the second committee. The second question was, okay, so you can't take all the existing scores and put them on the same scale. Suppose you take a set of items, like from a national, some kind of a nationally driven, national item pool of some sort, and embed them in these state tests. Now can you come up with some kind of, you know, pluribus and unum thing? And you can probably imagine the answer to that was no, and stop asking. But we said it more politely. For me, however, all of this, and especially Mosteller's question, raised a bigger issue about the way we treat educational policy decisions, and led me to think that that maybe the evidence about costs, in this case costs as measured by the threats to validity of a testing program and of scores, is not sufficient as a basis to dismiss the program unless you can adequately estimate both the intended and perhaps even the unintended benefits of such a program. Now, this would get me into, I think, a huge battle with Dan tonight, so I'm going to just move right along to the next topic. But that's essentially the story for me about what happened as a result of Mosteller's question and how important this is for us. Now, unfortunately, because I am boundedly rational, I have again done a bad job of estimating where I would be by this time. So I can't tell you this wonderful story I have about scientific research and education, as I promised I would. So let me just give you the tease line here, and then I encourage you're certainly welcome to read the paper as long as you promise not to hold me to anything I say there until I get a chance to fix it up. The storyline there is as follows. Here's this guy. He's got the beginnings of a theory about how education policy is made, or how it should be made, or at least how it should be understood. It's all wrapped up in this rhetoric of procedural rationality. The guy comes from the National Academy of Sciences. You'd think, and he has a sign in his office that says the plural of anecdote is not evidence. So you'd think he'd have more than just stories here, and he'd actually have some empirical evidence about this theory that he's blasting about. And you're quite right. And I worry about that. And I don't have a completely satisfying answer to that question. So I'll do what we learn how to do in Washington. That is, when a question is asked that you don't want to answer, you make up a different question that you think you can answer. And I'll answer that in the following way, just by saying this, that it leads me to wonder about what would be the procedurally rational way to validate my little theory, or for that matter, any theory about education. That leads me to the bigger question about what constitutes evidence, what should be standards of evidence in education research, about which, as you know, there is a huge fight going on today as we speak. In fact, today the Department of Education issued its policy guidance, its regulation on scientifically based research, and clearly giving priority preference to studies. So those of you that were upstairs writing proposals to the Department of Education before you came down here to listen to this, you should now go back up there and change it all into randomized controlled trials, because that's where the preference will be. And here again what you have is an example of policies that are probably well-intentioned, although there is a conspiracy, is a more conspiratorial view of what this is about, which I don't have to belabor. But suppose it's a well-intentioned idea to increase the scientific nature of education research and push education researchers to more and more empirical validation of what they are talking about, such as me. That's a good idea. If the effect is to so narrow education research that it crowds out historians, ethnographers, people doing seriously important qualitative inquiry, that would be a tragedy. And again, what we're missing here is the thermostat. So on that happy note, I will say, if you dare to come back for the third one, I will have, I hope, some more answers about how some of this might come together. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Michael. We now have three commentators, each of whom is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will open it up to the floor. The first person is Susan Moore Johnson, who studies and teaches about teacher policy, organizational change, and administrative practice. Then we jump to Noni Lasso, who is next to Michael. Noni's research is guided by the goal of examining the reading development and the developmental health of children who are at risk for learning difficulties. And then in the middle is Jennifer Steele, who is one of our doctoral students. She's a second-year doctoral student and a presidential fellow in administration planning and social policy, and she studies leadership and instructional reform in urban high schools. So they're just going to go one after another.
And we're going to be brief, I promise you, so we can have a good fight here and Dan can say what he really thinks. I read the paper over the weekend, and I kept thinking, why am I feeling so aggravated as I read this? How come I can't take this long, optimistic view about how all of this is going, and why am I so focused on what feels to me as if it's a very irrational thing going on in schools today? I have great respect for a lot of what's being done under NCLB, and I know that it is having tremendous impact in schools positively. But there's this other current of the rational, irrational posing as the rational that worries me a lot. And I think Michael was talking about it a little bit more when he was talking about the scientifically randomized trials and scientifically based research. I think that we are at a time where we are pretending that we understand so much more than we really understand, and that we're making attempts to be rational that well exceed what we know about how children learn and how people teach, and how very complicated that act is. That's despite all the papers that have been written about all that we know. I spent the weekend with my daughter, who's a fourth grade teacher, and I listened to her talk at length about what it means to teach Writer's Workshop in her fourth grade, about the various students she's working with, about the incredible needs that some of them have, about the social pressures that they feel, about how hard it is to get them to start with what they know and move to more sophisticated skills and critique each other's work productively. And then she started to talk about what happens when the tests come. And it was as if there are two different worlds for her. In the Writer's Workshop world, she really feels that she's teaching kids to write. And in the test world, her students are being asked to do things that aren't always connected with what she thinks they ought to be learning. And she is in a school that does not have scripted curriculum, but many of her colleagues that she was in graduate school with are teaching in schools with scripted curricula, and scientifically based though they are not succeeding with their students. We have a doctoral student here, Aurora Laura, who tells about teaching in an elementary school in Texas, where basically the teachers were doing double book accounting with their instruction. They were required to teach for Success for All in the morning. They were closely monitored. All the French would be very happy to know that they were on the right page at the right time, on the right day. And the teachers decided that their kids were really not learning to read. And so they were using a literature-based curriculum in the afternoon so that the kids would learn to read. And there's something tremendously irrational about a system that is pushing teachers who are looking for the most complicated, sophisticated, demanding ways to teach kids, and are confronting a variety of tests, a lot of tests in some cases, and instructional materials that limit what they're going to do. You talked a little bit, Michael, about the costs and the benefits, and I think we don't know what the costs are. I'm sure there are many benefits coming, in that some kids are being taught who were never taught before, and there's no question about that. But I study teachers, and I worry about who will teach. Testing has taken hold in schools. Teachers are afraid. I don't think we have to turn the thermostat up. I don't think it's about the incentive to perform. I think something much more complicated is going on. I also wanted to mention another rational effort to ensure that all our students will have highly qualified teachers by the year 2005, 2006. It is one of these policies that is being implemented through the aggregation of state-level definitions of what it means to be a highly qualified teacher. And those of you who know anything about this know that people are being designated highly qualified. In fact, in Wisconsin, 98% of the teachers are highly qualified. All the states are doing the licensing. Soon we will have highly qualified teachers in every classroom, and still kids won't know how to read or write. So I guess what I'm really urging is that we have to really be humble about what we know and cautious about using what we think we know.
What I wanted to do was pick up a little bit more on this notion of rationality, the procedural rationality as compared to more substantive rationality in the realm of education research. And given the complexities of the enterprise itself, it's certainly no wonder that we might talk about the system as one based on compromise, on reasonable deliberation, and one characterized perhaps as satisficing. However, the tendency to focus on kids in schools who are failing, coupled with a sense that all education research lacks in quality, has indeed created a climate for a focus on the shortcomings of the field. And perhaps an artificial sense that the optimal, and I use that in quotes, is within reach and always a potential reality. And thus a shift from that substantive rationality to this more to this notion of a procedural rationality may in fact be warranted. One that acknowledges the constraints imposed by the complexities of the population in the schools. One that acknowledges the political or cultural context might also be warranted. But on both sides of the coin, there's certainly some risk. So that on the one hand, we run the risk of the uninformed view that research paradigms, decisions, and the processes and principles on which cognitive psychology is based is unequivocally possible in education research. And certainly in this climate, there's the potential to very much to narrow the field, as we just heard about and discussed. And certainly none of us want to meet the doctoral student who comes in unclear about their question, but sure that growth modeling is the answer to the study. And so indeed, education research has to be more flexible with their thinking, with their methods, and in light of the children in classrooms, there is a need for heuristics and for some expediency in the decision-making processes, all of which satisfy the shift to a more procedurally, to this idea of procedural rationality in the system. But here I want to focus a little bit on a population rather than on the system and the policies and the teachers. With the shift to procedural rationality comes the potential to be overly satisfied with the status quo. And it certainly has the ability to absolve specific domains in the field of accountability to raise standards, to increase the rigor in the research, and to self-regulate with respect to recommendations to practitioners and policymakers. So here begs the question, are we ready for that kind of framework, of that kind of climate in every domain of education research? And here I'll be very narrow, and I want to draw here on the field of reading research, which has certainly been central to lots of debate, critical to the testing phenomenon and to some of the NRC reports. But there's a growing population of children from very diverse backgrounds in the system today, so that kids from minority backgrounds have grown by over 100% in the last 20 years, in the last 2 decades, whereas the overall school population has grown by only about 12%. By the year 2025, it's projected that there'll be several urban inner-city districts whereby today's minority are the majority. And kids in the classroom, certainly their linguistic proficiency is one whereby English is their second language. And these are kids who enter school at risk for difficulties and who are overrepresented later in special education programs. And what I want to be very clear about in this tension between the procedural rationality and the substantive rationality is that, in general, this is a body of research in education that lacks rigor, that lacks standards for empirical work, that has done very little to inform practice and policy, and it's the children who are shortchanged by this situation. And here I'm certainly not being conservative nor falling into the trap of criticizing education research. In this body of research, there's an acceptability to considering the findings of one study as evidence as using that in a discussion about practice and about policy. Where sample definitions are absent from the studies or ambiguous, and where the political agenda related to the educational programming for these learners has come through very clearly and very much at the expense of a more objective look at the critical and salient variables that we would want to know much more about for the sake of the instruction and to promote the achievement of these kids in the classrooms. The absence of replication of findings in this area and the tendency to overstate the case and the findings has plagued this field. And so, with good reason, and not surprisingly, there's a whole lot of educational guesswork going on with these kids. Too much wisdom and not enough science behind the instruction. And so many of these kids are either overlooked in the system for special education services because they have a genuine learning difficulty, whereas others are placed in special education because we lack the understanding of the normative trajectory for a child who enters school without English as their native language. And the research itself is certainly cuts across a number of disciplines: psychology, anthropology, sociology, epidemiology. But these studies do nothing to acknowledge the findings of one another, to consider new variables in their typical paradigm because they're working with a more diverse population. And as a case in point to the issue of the broader education research, the fragmentation in the field suggests the press for more cohesion, to find a balance, and here borrowing from many researchers, particularly Stanovich in the area of reading, talks about the balance between the craft and the science. And it calls for a generation of researchers and policymakers and educators trained with an understanding of some core concepts in the field, the layers of complexity for which education research is the context of education research. And so as we think more about the state of education research and the state of practice, although there are domains in which we are very much ready to move from perhaps an unattainable, optimal, or substantive rationality to one that's more procedural, I guess I also beg the question of whether we're ready in all domains of education research to have that frame of mind, and that in fact there are cases where we still need a very strong push for more accountability and higher standards.
So I'm a doctoral student, and as such, I'm a researcher in training. And as a researcher in training, I'm so sympathetic to this idea of procedural rationality, because doing really good research is very, very hard, I'm learning. So that is, so as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, the understanding that if we're frozen by the sense that we're never going to reach the optimal solution, if that stops us from moving forward in trying to improve schools, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's kind of how I came into this. But then I started thinking about the practitioner perspective. And I have been a high school teacher, and it struck me, and I've been in many conversations recently with high school and public school administrators. So what struck me is that procedural rationality really is the domain of the practitioner historically. I mean, this is where you've got kids in front of you, you've got kids in your school, and you've got to make decisions rapidly on a daily basis, and you've got to act on heuristics. You cannot control for all the variables, you cannot look at all of the evidence, you've got to move forward. So then I thought, okay, logically then, practitioners should be willing to embrace this model of procedural rationality in policymaking. And I think that perhaps that may be the case, and I don't know. But then it struck me that in my own experience, I had seen perhaps the opposite thing happening, which was that in a school, if you're accustomed to using heuristics and going off of intuition and best judgments based on the limited evidence that you have, then maybe you are going to be resistant to somebody coming in with different evidence unless it's really, really good and it's really, really better than what you've got, and it's really, really scientifically rigorous, and somebody has put a stamp on it with the rigor of with the rhetoric of optimal rationality, the rigor of saying this is the gold standard, this is a randomized trial. If somebody brings you that in a school, then maybe you're willing to give it a try. But if it's somebody else's guesswork and you're the person in the classroom that has to deliver this instruction, then maybe you're going to be resistant to that guesswork. So I thought, so where does the practitioner fit into this model? And I taught in a school system in San Diego that was recently undergoing huge reforms system-wide, and I know that Noni has worked with San Diego as well, and probably a lot of you are familiar with the story, but there was a large district-wide reform, and I was teaching at the high school level, and a lot of the reform hinged around teaching literacy in a particular way, using Readers Writers Workshop that Susan has alluded to. Only I was teaching at the high school level, and I had a range of kids, from kids who were struggling readers to kids who were about to take the advanced placement exam. And what I found with a lot of the teachers that I worked with was the sense that this Readers Writers Workshop model that had been imported from a different city, from an elementary district, from an entirely different environment, and seemed good enough according to the procedural rationality, the bounded rationality of the people who were imposing it, to us maybe wasn't quite right for the specifics that we were dealing with. And so I thought, okay, if we're going to use procedural rationality at the policy level, we're in trouble, because we've got to hold policymakers to a higher standard. You can't just bring something in with limited evidence, as Noni was saying, and expect it to be expected to work. But then I thought, okay, what was the problem in the case that I referred to? Was it the rhetoric of, was it the fact that the evidence wasn't there, that maybe there was some reliance on heuristics, or was it the fact that the rhetoric was one of optimization? The idea that we've got to do it this way, and if we do it this way, and everybody does it, and everybody's on board, we're going to get every single kid. And that is the language of substantive rationality. And so it struck me that maybe there is a place for procedural rationality, and maybe if there had been some debate and discussion among many stakeholders, where you really do have to tackle the complexity of the perspectives of many stakeholders within the system. Maybe if there had been openness on the part of policymakers to that kind of nuance and that kind of subtlety, we would have been able to move forward in a way that was satisfying to more people. So that convinced me that perhaps perhaps this kind of procedural rationality, when it infuses the perspectives of more people and acknowledges greater complexity, can be a powerful force.
Great. Michael, do you want to comment, or would you rather get some questions from the floor?
Yes and no. These are great comments, and I thank you, all three of you. I'd like to see if others want to get in on this,
Great.
and then I can give me a
Great.
few more minutes.
We have time for one or two questions. People are worried about the weather right now. Dan, you've virtually been called upon.
I'm happy to give a comment, but I'm also happy not to if others have questions or comments.
Questions? Comments?
Well, I'll comment.
Can you go to the microphone so we can...
Washington Anecdote bears on psychometric science and education policy. When I was fresh out of grad school, I was working for the Congressional Budget Office and was given the chore, you know this story, of evaluating a healthcare cost containment program. Our evaluation came to the conclusion that the program was losing a trivial amount of money, maybe a dime on the dollar, and the agency's evaluation came to the conclusion that it was saving a little bit of money, about a dime on the dollar. And so I was given the job of writing the testimony, though not giving it, because in Washington it's rank rather than expertise that determines who gives it. So the way I wrote it was to say that within any reasonable estimate of a margin of error, these were the same results. That the program was apparently not losing or saving a lot of money, and if Congress wanted to keep it or get rid of it, they would have to find another reason. And the chair of the committee, whose name was, honest to God, J.J. Pickle, leaned over furious and said, "What the hell is this margin of error stuff? Doesn't that mean you don't know what you're talking about?"
Yeah.
And being a year out of grad school, I was so terrified that I couldn't really think of a response until, unfortunately I didn't have to because I wasn't giving the testimony, until I was safely out of the room. But the right answer was yes, it's an effort to quantify how much we don't know what the hell we're talking about. And that actually is directly relevant to your comments about psychometrics, because there are other areas of science in which people are dealing with uncertainty all the time, but they then come forward and say, you didn't know anything before about the actions of statins or MAO inhibitors or whatever. We'll tell you within some range of error what we think the answer is, and you know more than you did before. Then the New York Times publishes something else, and you realize you knew less than you thought, but you still learn more from hearing this. In education, people who are careful about sciences like psychometrics are always in the position, or often in the position, of having to tell people they know less than they think they do, because they think the answer is very clear and science says it's not clear. That has a really corrosive effect on the relationship between science and policy, because policymakers get truly annoyed, in my experience, with having scientists come up and say, no, you actually know less than you think you did. Right. And I don't know that there's a good way out of the box, but I think it's something we have to be aware of.
Great comment. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Otherwise, we will thank Michael and adjourn.
Thank you.